A very good evening to all of you joining us this evening, a Monday evening, every Monday at 9 p.m. The Spotlight, bringing to you a story that will ignite change. Now, dear viewers, climate change is something that is crucial not only to us as Sri Lankans but to everyone around the world. If we do not take action now, then when? For this, we have someone very special with us in our studios joining us to talk on how important it is to take action and make a change for the future generations. With us today, we have Vositha Wijenayake, Attorney at Law and Executive Director, Slyke and Trust Global. Thank you for joining us in our studios today. It's going to be a very informative based discussion today. So to start things off, let's hear something about you and the work that you do in relation to Slyke and Trust Global as well.
Thank you, Mariella, for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. So Slyke and Trust is a non-profit think tank. Our headquarters is based in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and we work in Asia, Africa and Europe. The work we focus on is in policy as well as action, so climate sustainable development, social justice, animal welfare and also ecosystem and biodiversity conservation. But today, of course, we'll be speaking about climate change, which also has a connection to all that we are discussing, which I've mentioned. Yeah.
All right, so that was a brief introduction about our guest, which is very important. Now moving on to more questions, Vositha, let's discuss in relation to Sri Lanka. What do you think are the most pressing issues in relation to climate change in our country?
So when we're speaking about climate change, there are different aspects to it, right?
Yeah.
So there's mitigation, which is cutting down of emissions, and then adapting to climate change, because climate change is already there. The impacts are already felt, so adapting to these impacts. And then there's also addressing climate-induced losses and damages, or loss and damage as we call it in the technical terminology of it. That means what we have already felt and what loss that we've incurred, how to address it. So we're looking at exacerbation of extreme and slow onset disasters that we face. For example, the increase in rainfall or the lack of it rather. At some times, the droughts that we face, the floods that are more than that we would usually feel, the temperature increase, which would have implications on food security, as well as a lot of other economic sectors. It could be across the board. So what's important about climate change is that it's not restricted to one conversation. It impacts us in different ways and it's relevant to everyone. It's not necessarily only for a farmer who's working on growing paddy or maize or anything that we're growing, but it's also for someone who's an educator, because awareness creation, education on climate change is important. So looking at different angles to it, how economic impacts are felt, how economy is impacted by the impacts of climate change, and taking measures is important, because we cannot do anything without considering these impacts of climate change. So for Sri Lanka as an island state, sea level rise would be something to look at, increase in salinity, which would impact the agriculture sector, then again, as I mentioned, floods and droughts, and also human mobility that would happen internally, as well as that would have implications going out of the country as well.
Vositha, in Sri Lanka, do we have any policies that regulate things in relation to climate change?
Yes. Again, it's wider as well as narrow in the sense of, if you say climate change specific, we do have climate change policy, then the Climate Change Act that is in the process of being developed at the moment, as well as the new climate change policy. But we also have commitments we've made globally. So for example, under the Paris Agreement, Sri Lanka has committed under the nationally determined contributions what we would do as climate action. And this has multiple sectors we focus on. And we have committed conditionally and unconditionally. So when you say unconditional, that means Sri Lanka says we're going to do these actions from our own resources. And conditional would be dependent on whether we get means of implementation, for example, finance, transfer of technology from outside. Right. So there are different levels of commitment, and then also sustainability reporting that's there, SDG reporting that's there, then also environmental regulations that are there that would play a role in how we take climate action. So it's not just one thing, but a lot of laws would be relevant as well as other policies we have.
How do you think our role will be to ensure that these laws will be consistently implemented in the future?
So again, multiple facets to this. One is having laws that can be implemented that would be robust, and also looking into the present and future projections of climate impact. So it's very important that policies, laws, and actions that we take are evidence-based, so we know what we need to do to target what would happen in the future. And also having a process, a structure that would implement this, so the institutional capacities, the knowledge about these laws amongst communities, the population in general, and the stakeholders. And also making sure that they're implemented, reported, and regulated in a manner that we have an understanding how this happens. But I think also boils down to the fact that education needs to play a role. Just having a policy would not necessarily mean it's going to be implemented effectively if people do not follow it. So awareness and education would be important, and the capacity to do this, the implementation with support, the institutional capacity as well as technical support. So capacity building would play a key role, and also multi-stakeholder collaboration and common engagement in implementation and reporting. I think that would be also very important.
How do you think we could strike the balance between economic development and environmental preservation? It's two very important things. How do we balance that?
Yeah, so I think all the issues that we have today is because we did not consider the environment when we were looking at development. So we looked at industrialization, and then if you look at it, it's purely because of development and economic aspect, and not thinking about what would be the repercussions if we do not consider, right? So that's why we're talking about sustainable development today, which would take into consideration social, environment, and economic development together. So it's important to look at development. It is needed, but economic development is also dependent of the availability of resources, the natural resources. So if we overexploit them, there would not be development beyond a certain point. So one is looking at how sustainable development could happen, and also taking measures of the resources we have and how these can be protected to generate economic empowerment and enhancement and livelihoods. So it's important that we understand the value of the environment, then think of how this could contribute to generation of the economy, and also taking actions based on that. So if if you're making a decision or a policy related to our economic empowerment, what would be the impacts on the environment? How would this create benefits or repercussions or damages? And taking into consideration, and then ensuring that these are mitigated. It's very important. And building the economy around the resources we have in a conserving and also protecting manner. I think that's quite important as well. So there's also environmental economics that people study, and having education based on these things would contribute to our economy, which takes into consideration the right to development, plus the conservation and protection of the environment.
As a society and as someone working closely in policy making and all of that, how do you think we can ensure to get the people's opinions in decision making, their opinions? How do you think we can go through that?
So I think a lot of policies in Sri Lanka has a 30-day notice that is there. So once the final draft is out there, there's a public call for input, and that would feed into the process.
Right.
But a lot of people don't know about this and do not engage in it. So I think that as a population, as citizens, we do need to engage when there's the opportunity. That's the first step, I think. But that's the last step also in some ways, because the policy is drafted and people see it only at that point if you do say it. So before that, when the processes are there, it's important that there are consultations, take into consideration public opinion on the key elements, at least, not word by word, but at least the overarching key things. So one, that is the general public, the civil society, and the population I'm generally talking about.
So for this, they will have to sort of head over to an institution or something like that, isn't it?
So you have different stakeholders, right? And we have different roles. So I think if it's the government institutes that are part of the policy making, that stakeholder engagement component is very important. Knowing who are the experts on the topic, which organizations work on this, how can the private sector play a role in it, what is their role, what is the communication people's role in it, youth, and also those who are impacted by this decision. So it's important that there's a structure of data gathering, information gathering, prior to the drafting happening, which would be the ideal scenario. So having a stakeholder engagement process, a strategy under certain ministries, I think this happens in many of them. I can't say it happens in all because I haven't worked with all the ministries, but at least the ones I've worked with, there is a process most of the time at a certain level. But that doesn't mean everyone knows about it. So I think there's a role for the communicators in this. So if there's like a close connection between the policymaking process with media and those who communicate, and when something is happening that is relevant, that it's communicated to the mass, that would be helpful. So that would create a position amongst the communities and also give information to the community. And that's at the national level. But you do have the divisional, district level, provincial level processes, which would have a close connection with the communities, the people as well. So making use of national as well as local level governance systems would play a key role also. So the stakeholder engagement at national, at local, but also a connection between the local and the national. I mean, this is an ideal scenario I'm talking about, but at least some steps towards it would be great. Yes.
You know, one drop makes a mighty ocean.
Yes, exactly.
So moving on to my next question for you, Vositha, it is very important that students at a very young age, they get into the culture of, you know, fostering sustainability. So how do you think educational institutes can step into the game and create that environment for students and, you know, take up that challenge in what we are facing today?
Yes, so I think education, not just as an institute, but as a whole system, I think, and also in the global process that relate to climate change. You would have a process or like a thematic area called Action for Climate Empowerment, and education is a key component of this. So this is globally understood, and I think it's nationally understood already as well, and there's a lot of actions happening which are potentially not public yet that relate to this. It can happen via the government sector, but also private sector has taken actions as well as civil society. And there are different levels of it, right? You have the formal education, you have the vocational training and skill development that have a role to play, as well as the early education, as well as schools, right? So I think it starts with prioritizing environment, sustainability, climate literacy, and integrating it into the system as a whole, and then identifying what relates to which sector or, you know, how to integrate it, to better integrate based on the resources we have as well. So it would mean that the teachers, the educators would need to be aware, the technical capacity to do this task of teaching those who are part of the system, plus also active education and skill development. So for example, we are used to reading things most of the time, but environment and sustainability is also practical aspects of it. So integrating assignments, projects that would be maybe counting into their education certification plus as a choice, so that there's an interest generated. And I think this is something that's been looked at, which is a good thing, and hopefully we would see this put into action soon. But I also believe that it needs to be like benefiting all, the access to these resources, not necessarily only people who are in the urban areas, but also outside and who would be very close to the nature themselves, how they can make the best of it through education to ensure that the resources can be utilized to enhance their livelihoods. So it's a very big process of doing it, but I think we can start at some point and do it.
So continuing with more questions, because I'm trying to squeeze in as many questions as we can, because it is a very important topic like I mentioned. Vositha, who are the key stakeholders in this fight against climate change? Who are on the front line?
I think the front line would be the communities that are most affected, I believe, but it's also everyone on the front lines. Because everyone is impacted, not just in Sri Lanka, but everywhere. And all policy makers, as well as private sector, all stakeholders. So it's a category of who is most vulnerable, depending on our resilience levels, the capacities, but you cannot say it's just one stakeholder. But the roles would be different, obviously. So you would have the policymakers having to integrate these components into policymaking. That would be the key things to be addressing climate change. And then you would have the academia, the researchers, and the technical experts who need to contribute to generate evidence and contribute to making policies. Then the private sector, that would be a way of means of implementation coming in, but also ensuring in their processes that action related to climate change is taken. civil society that has a key role, communities, youth, media. So I don't think anyone is exempted in taking action. Yes.
Vositha, now how can public and private partnerships contribute to scaling up climate action?
Yeah, so I think in the past we have this private sector action that happens, and then there's the public that could be the general government process or overall that happens. But over the years, the importance of having partnerships has been understood, and also multi-stakeholder action, or new terms, multi-actor processes. In this, private sector has a key role, so does the public plus the communities. Having business models that are innovative, inclusive, participatory would help to guide long-term resilience in the correct projection or the track. So one is ensuring that public sector and private sector work together, which can be, like I mentioned, to access means of implementation, which would relate to technology, technical expertise, finance. And then also making sure that mitigation actions in the production cycles by the private sector is also reported, so that we know the good examples, also that the actions are taken in a manner that's reported, climate-friendly, ethical and sustainable. And also the awareness of policy that's there, and then taking into consideration the communities or those most vulnerable in the solutions that are generated. So that's where the communities, public and the public sense of government plus the communities, those vulnerable, are included in the solutions, which can be driven by the private sector, so that the benefits come to the communities at the ground level who are facing climate change impacts. So it's a broader concept of it. Application can be, again, multi-actor driven, but end result would be that we would have long-term resilience generated.
So different stakeholders, it's human to have different opinions. So in terms of policies, there might be friction when it comes to policies. So how do you think we can overcome that challenge?
I think it all goes back to that information sharing, informed decision making and participation.
Okay.
So if you have the policy making process in an inclusive and participatory manner, then the key stakeholders who have the technical expertise, as also the challenges that might come up, they would be at the table or whatever the process that we have in the same room, or they'd be informed in a regular manner. So the conflicts that would be generated would be minimal, at least in a scenario that I would envisage. So that inclusion, information sharing, participation, continued engagement, and also awareness creation on the issues that we are focusing on. Like you questioned earlier, the right to development. So people would say this is our right to development. But then how long can you keep or maintain this development? So we need to address the economic crisis or the needs that we might be facing in certain time frames, but take into consideration the fact that if we do not take collective action or actions that take into consideration long-term impacts, that it would be a benefit that happens short-term. So that needs to be understood, and I think, again, comes back to that informed, climate literate population that could have a good conversation and engage in a manner that is beneficial and concrete, productive, action-based. A lot of adjectives, but I'm just trying to use the correct adjective here. Yeah.
Okay, Vositha, now we are coming into another very interesting section, entrepreneurship and innovation. It is a hot topic these days. How do you think these two can be incorporated in terms of climate action and climate change? I think you might be able to speak on this as well, since Like and Trust does a lot of work in relation to this.
Yes, so climate, so we do work on entrepreneurship, and that has a lot of focus on the local level as well.
Right.
One gap we saw is that skill development in entrepreneurship happens sometimes only to a group of people who have information, who would potentially have the capacity to learn in English.
Okay.
And it might not necessarily sometimes be from the communities that are actually facing the impacts. So at Like and Trust, we wanted to bridge this gap. Our model is called Ethical X, Klima Innovation Hub, and we work with different actors to ensure that it's a multi-actor driven process. Say if it's the food system focused entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurs, the communities, government sector as well as the private sector are part of this planning process and we would identify based on evidence risks that country faces, what needs to happen. So coming back to why entrepreneurship is important because it comes back to the economic and livelihood enhancement, generation, empowerment, and also looking at context-based, needs-based solution finding. And I think this is something of one of the hot topics that people are talking about at the moment. And SMEs, micro businesses, those would be also needed as a focus. And again, looking at what's good for a larger audience. So there are a lot of focus areas even in the policy processes, looking at the livelihood component, resilience building component, how entrepreneurship would play a role in it. And then the entrepreneurial skills can be in the vocational training processes as well as universities. That's where the projects I mentioned come to play a role. So not just the business management students, but also those who are potentially studying science, engineering, technology-related ones, as well as other subjects, working together, cross-sectoral approaches to how finding solutions through entrepreneurship could happen. In the work that we've done with you, there's definitely a lot of interest. A gap we've seen is that a lot of people go for trainings, but maybe sometimes this is not catered to the need. So it's important to understand which region, what solution, the solution being brought from someone from the region or who understands the region. So we do work on entrepreneurship in different countries, not just only Sri Lanka. And it's a different experience. So by the context, by the need, we need to generate the solutions. And again, having that link to policy and policy awareness and access to information play a role here as well. So if someone is producing something, how can this be exported?
Yeah.
What might be the restrictions that are there? What needs to be there as information? And that reporting element, it's hard sometimes to make sure good reporting on the production cycle is there and the importance of it, and data availability and accessibility in the production cycles as well. So there are things that are technical, and it's again a connected process which cannot be done in isolation. Otherwise, it's one-off actions that would not necessarily be long-term solutions.
You were also mentioning about SMEs.
Yes.
What is the role that they play in, fostering green technology?
I think in Sri Lanka, a lot of new solutions come through the SME sector. And I mean, green solutions that could be sustainable focused ones, or climate focused ones, or even ethical aspect focused ones, right? So most of the solutions that might generate into large scale ones would start at a small level, right? So SMEs are involved, and we work with a lot of SMEs. But I think there are a lot of micro businesses involved as well, if you look at community level livelihood generation. So I think we need to take those together as well. But a lot of sectors that we look at, food systems would be something important to look at. For example, for food security, protein options that would be there to address the nutritional values and all. How can that be based on Sri Lanka's resources, plant-based protein, for example, and then looking into aspects like even handloom and artisanal values, and supporting SMEs that focus on those.
So, Vositha, how do you think we can equip individuals and communities with the skills and knowledge that is needed to adapt to climate change and to make them resilient?
Yeah, so economic empowerment is one, and the resources for that is important. And then education, information, enhanced climate literacy, that would be important. And then finance to do all these things, which plays a key role. I think we'll probably get into the conversation on that as well. So means of implementation, that means the capacity building, institutional capacity that would reach to people on the ground. Technical capacity of individuals who are working on climate change, but also accessing technology that might not be there, the technical expertise to do a solution that we generate. So there's a role to play for everyone, but there's also the importance of changing our mindset as a community, as a population, and understanding this is important. It's not just the term, climate change. We might not use the connection between climate, the word, and the impact that we are feeling. So if you ask everyone who's complaining about the temperature increase, how warm it is, or how the rains are so much that we cannot do our cultivation the same way. So it's understanding, okay, this is there at the moment, and it's a collective action needed, and that it's needed. It's not someone else's job. some things might be someone else's job, but everyone has a job as well.
So now let's get into our next segment, youth empowerment.
Okay.
Something very important as well. So how do you think the youth can be encouraged into taking this field? But I think the youth are now actually taking a more active role. But the youth, let's talk about the youth on the outskirts of Colombo. What about them?
I think they do take a more active role than potentially sometimes those in cities,
Right.
because they might be working or they are working with their parents and engaging in actions in agriculture potentially, or they are closer to the nature. So we work with youth from outside of Colombo quite often in projects that we do. So there's a lot of interest and also engagement. So I wouldn't say that assumption that people in Colombo do more work would come into play in this case. But it's not just that now that youth are taking action, it's just that now there's more reporting on what youth are taking as actions. I think 15 years ago there was an interest, but now there's a better understanding of climate change. So there's better engagement potentially and also better access to sharing what we're doing. So at one point our climate action would have been a day-to-day activity. Now we have a tag that we have put on it saying climate action, so we are taking action. But it's all good. Either way, the fact that there's enhanced understanding, enhanced focus, and capacity building opportunities, and also hopefully for everyone to engage at the same level with resources being allocated. So coming back to the importance of youth engagement, obviously the fact that they would live longer than I would if I'm not youth anymore, and they would have to face the impacts of climate change longer than I would potentially as well. And also they would have solutions and innovative ideas, and they need to be given technical capacity to ensure that these solutions connect with climate evidence and science, and also avenues for better engagement. So at Like and Trust, we actually started something about 6 years ago called Global Youth Forum on Climate Change, which was initiated in Sri Lanka, but now it's a global platform where youth from different countries engage and have their solutions, or they would focus on a stakeholder engagement process where youth and climate change is integrated into policy processes. So in countries in Africa, Asia, all over the world, there's youth taking action and also engaging in a global discussion. Because it's important that we have this connection, not necessarily in our locality or in our country, but also to what happens outside. Because otherwise you're thinking only in terms of what happens here. Your mindset is very focused on a narrow focus, right? So climate action is global. While we need to take local action, we also need to know what's happening outside, which could have implications. So education system, again, could play a key role. I know we are talking about a climate change university.
Yes, I was actually going to ask you about that as well.
So I'm not an authority to speak on it, but I think it's a good initiative that's being taken, and how this functions in the system that we have or through a new system is something to be looked at. But it's definitely an important thing to look into climate change and education, not just necessarily at the university level, but also across the spectrum. And also the opportunities that can be generated. It could be through entrepreneurship, it could be through livelihood generation for youth, it could be a platform for them to engage and share their solutions, and also this multi-stakeholder connection, where youth have a key role to play, but also other stakeholders take them into consideration. So if there's a project being developed, how can youth play a role? Or youth being a key group across all actions of this. So I think everyone has to think about it, but youth also. How can we learn? How can we better inform ourselves? Where do these resources exist? How can I get this? And who do we need to get in touch with? So rather than waiting for it to come to you, also to take action on their own. I'm not saying it's not happening. It's happening. It's great to see it, but I think we can support and enhance and scale up all what's happening related to youth empowerment, as well as development of their literacy. Yeah.
We were talking about the importance of finances in terms of climate change. Where do we stand in terms of sources and the funding for climate change?
Okay, so there is a process of climate finance mechanisms and also accessing finance that is primarily connected to the UN process, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So for example, Green Climate Fund or Adaptation Fund, Global Environment Facility that would also support climate action. So these are processes that the country could access funding for climate action from. And we have access funding for several projects, I think about 3-4 at the moment, amounting to a certain amount of millions. And there's also outside this process where you can access funding. And that would be related to different actions, but potentially could be the energy sector, where you have the Solar Alliance working together to access funding for scaling up. I wouldn't call it a funding mechanism, but certain processes that would generate or connect with funding processes, where Sri Lanka is already part of or could be part of. And different stakeholders also have this, where you have multiple actors together who can access funding as a collection to implement a project, which also happens. So there are different avenues. It's the question of availability of finance, or the amount of finance available, and the need for climate finance from those who need to provide funding. For example, if you look at the UNFCCC process, it's the annex ones or the developed countries that have the obligation under the legal process to provide finance for climate action. So that's one format of it. But there are also voluntary processes outside of this. For example, Global Shield, which was recently set up, has over 200 million at the moment, I think, of funding for accessing to address risk management, risk transfer of climate change. So identifying these opportunities based on their focuses and then accessing funding is important. And having a system that could manage the finance is also important. Say if we want to do a regional project, not just in Sri Lanka, but other countries, can Sri Lanka do that in our banking format or the fiduciary capacities format? So these things we need to look at if we want to scale up the access of climate finance in the country. And we do have some national implementing entities, or at least one, for GCUF, and some others are also available, and multilateral entities can also support this. Civil society organizations can support this, and also private sector. So why is private sector important? Because banking sector can provide support in accessing finance, as also managing finances in the reporting base that's important.
Leading into my next question is about the private sector. How do you think they can step in terms of entrepreneurship, innovation, sustainability? How can they help out?
Again, two ways. One is if they have finance to do certain actions on climate change, they could provide this if they have the means of implementation. But they could also be entities accessing finance, merging into their work the projects that would be on climate change. But it's important that the private sector does this in a way that does not block the beneficiaries from getting the benefits. Like, say, if it's a community that needs to access funding, and if it's a community-based organization that needs to access funding, then supporting those on the ground to access funding would be important. So having that partnership rather than a larger entity accessing all the funds. So I think it's important to see how those who are at the forefront access funding and have the benefits of this when we are engaging different actors as well. But I think private sector, even other entities, have a key role to play in this, especially in accessing funding, I think. If there's like stringent reporting processes or fiduciary standards, I believe private sector and banking sector could play a key role in it.
So can these investors and people in the financing, how can they incorporate when they take decisions? How do you think they should take into consideration on the importance of climate change when they make decisions?
Okay, I think I actually missed the entry point for your previous one. Good that you asked this question. So one is if it's the banks, for example, and entrepreneurship, you could select for loan schemes, okay, those who have key components related to climate mitigation, adaptation, addressing these standards of sustainability. So I know certain banks have this already. Some of them are involved in our work as well. But having it as a priority and informing those who are interested in doing processes related to climate change would be important. That's one thing. And then putting a certain percentage of benefits generated into climate action. That could be a CSR thing, or it could be part of their production cycles or their financial reporting cycles. So providing finance through that sort of mechanism. So for example, if I have a company, for example, our partnership, which is with Ethical X like and Trust and Climafuge. Climafuge is a private sector entity, but that's solely for the purpose of supporting climate action. Even if you run at a loss, it would be with that in mind. So we don't expect other people to run at a loss, but having certain specific ones which are climate focused as private sector entities would also be helpful. But I think banking sector has a big role to play, and they can play a role, and they have played a role as well. So looking into these avenues and supporting who are really committed to create change through avenues that they have, I think that would go a long way.
Let me get into the question of asking you, it is very important that as a country that we maintain relationships with other countries as well. How important is it?
Okay, in the context of climate change and international engagement, you do have the possibility of engaging at the United Nations Framework Convention level, which focuses on climate change, UNFCCC we call it, and we do have negotiations, collective actions, regional programs that would be relevant. As I mentioned earlier, while climate change would impact at national and local level, what we feel is not necessarily because we've contributed as a country, but it's also other countries that have taken action that have led to climate change, right? So it's important to find the solutions together as well, and also access finance and means of implementation through collective measures or transfer of technology and also information. So there's a whole different spectrum of how collective action could happen. And it's always important not to be isolated and in a silo, not knowing what's happening in the policy circles globally as well. Not that we are in that situation, but I'm just highlighting why we shouldn't be. And taking effective and efficient measures to better engage and enhance our engagement for concrete needs to be addressed through evidence-based decision-making processes. So we need to identify what's priorities for us as climate action, and then have collective measures with other countries, the international processes, to access funding and means of implementation, and also to share our good practices and lessons learned, because there's a lot that happens in Sri Lanka, and it needs to be communicated nationally as well as outside, because that would provide us opportunities to be a leader in climate action being taken, plus also help out other countries who could learn from us. So for example, risk management processes in Sri Lanka have been longer existing than many other countries. And it would be also a responsibility for us to share this so others could learn from us and also get recognition for other country. Even the youth engagement. So Sri Lanka does facilitate in the climate processes for youth to engage. There are certain initiatives that are there. How can these be models for other countries to take as solutions? Because being a developing country, we are in a special position to be a leader through the things that we have done well, and also learning what we haven't done well and engaging with others who might have solutions for it would also provide us the opportunity to do better as well.
As someone engaging in this fight against climate change, you're fighting for all the good things. What is the role that you expect from responsible media organizations, media outlets in promoting a positive change for climate change?
I think this conversation happened in 2014 or so, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change discussed the narrative, because there's a lot of narratives in films, articles, talking about the doom and gloom of climate change and creating fear. But with that, we need to have solutions also. What can be the solution? The fact that we can take measures. And to do that, informed communication, right? So this misinformation concepts and how we have evidence-based communication would be something to look at. And that comes with media being a key stakeholder in the process, and them engaging in the policy processes as well, so that they're informed of what's happening. So if something good is happening, share it. If there's a good example, share it. If there's something bad happening, do keep everyone informed as well, because that's a key component of it. But also technical capacity building and general capacity building of media would also help in this process. We, of course, at SLAC Entrust, we try to engage as much as possible with media and communicators. We have fellowships depending on certain thematic areas that are offered. But most importantly, keep informed of the research and publications we have, which could potentially contribute to the communication that happens. But I think it's also important, go to the ground, report what's happening on the ground, good initiatives by those who are at the forefront, front lines. Visual reporting is also very important, I think.
Well, time is ticking. If you could briefly give a message to all our viewers watching us right now.
Okay, so first I'd like to thank you for focusing on climate change. And the message I would like to give is that climate change and climate action, policy and action, is not one narrowed down topic. It grows across everything, and it's the responsibility of all. Some more than others, but it's a change of lifestyle and also being conscious when we make decisions. I think we all have a role to play, but that would guide us towards a long-term resilience build, empowered and sustainably developed country. So I think it's worth it. Take that action and work together.
Well, thank you, Vositha, for joining us today. Time has caught up, but we are hoping so that we can bring you back in as well later on for a few more discussions, because this is something that is very important. So thank you for taking your time to be here with us, and wishing you and your team nothing but the very best.
Thank you, Mariella.
Well, that brings us to the end of this week's edition of The Spotlight, exclusively on Vasantham TV and the official YouTube channel of Prime Television. Make sure you drop by again next Monday at 9 p.m. as well. Have a great night ahead.